You're not supposed to be awake right now, but your mind is restless. Tonight, let's step into the boots of a soldier, not the movie kind. Not the heroic music or glory-filled battles. This is the real life of a forgotten soldier. Mud, fear, cold nights, and silence. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let's go back to the war, where sleep was a luxury no man could afford. It began not with gunfire or smoke, but with silence. A silence that came before the war had even reached the boy named Thomas. He lived in a modest brick house on the edge of a slow, forgettable town where mornings were foggy and newspapers arrived folded with care. The year was 1939, but in his little corner of England, it felt no different than the year before. The chimney puffed like always. The tap water ran a little rusty in the mornings like always. The bakery 2 doors down still sold stale bread afternoon like always. Thomas was 19. His fingers were always cold and his boots too tight. He worked in the back of a printing shop, where he trimmed pamphlets with a dull blade and swept up piles of dust. His boss rarely spoke, except to complain that ink was expensive or the paper was late. Days blurred. He walked to work. He walked home. A kettle boiled. A neighbor's dog barked. The calendar pages turned slowly. When war was declared, no one shouted. The voice came from the radio, low and firm, as if reading a grocery list. Something about Germany, something about Poland, something about honor. Thomas was standing in the doorway with a chipped mug in his hand, and his mother stood behind him, drying a plate. They looked at the radio together for a moment, as if it had betrayed them. There were no soldiers on the street the next day, no tanks, no shouting, just colder mornings and longer newspaper headlines. But in the weeks that followed, signs began to appear on brick walls and bus stations. Your country needs you. Men with serious eyes and proud hats stared out from posters. Thomas read them without blinking. He kept walking. Then came the conscription papers. Not sudden, not shocking, just something expected, like a bill in the mail. The envelope was thin and official. The letter inside called him by name and told him where to report. There was no threat. There didn't need to be one, he told his mother. She nodded. She had already packed some of his socks. The train station was gray that morning and wet. A mist clung to the gravel like a second skin. Men stood in line, not speaking much. Some smoked, some yawned. Thomas held his small brown suitcase by the handle. Inside was one extra shirt, a dull razor, a bar of soap wrapped in paper. A soldier walked past them, barking something about order and names. His boots were polished, but his eyes were tired. They boarded. The train whined as it moved. The windows streaked with soot. The countryside outside passed like a memory. Old barns, distant sheep, flat fields. No one on the train smiled. Thomas sat by the window and stared until his eyes burned. A man beside him tried to hum a tune, but gave up halfway through. The barracks were made of wood and smelled of wet wool. The beds were narrow, the mattresses thin. The first night was loud. Men snored. One cried. Someone got up 3 times to use the latrine. The heater sputtered and died by midnight, and frost crept across the glass by dawn. They were woken at 4:30 a.m. not by sunlight, but by shouting. The kind that didn't need to be loud to be final. On your feet, they said. Shirts tucked, blankets folded, boots on. The floor was cold on their toes. Thomas moved slowly, his fingers fumbling with buttons. Breakfast was gray. Porridge, or something like it. No sugar, no milk. A biscuit that could chip a tooth. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons louder than speech. Training began with marching, always marching, one foot, then the other, again and again, left, right, left, right. If someone stumbled, they started over. If someone yawned, They started over. The sergeant's voice became background noise, like the hum of a machine that never stopped. Then came drills. Drop, crawl, stand, repeat. Bayonets were dull. Rifles were heavy. Everything smelled of grease. Evenings weren't for rest. They were for cleaning. Gear had to shine. Beds had to be flat. Buttons had to glint like coins. Thomas found a rhythm in it, not peace, but habit. His hands remembered what to do, even if his thoughts wandered. Some nights he lay on the thin mattress, staring at the wood above him, listening to others breathe. One man spoke in his sleep. Another snored like a saw on wood. Letters were allowed once a week. He wrote to his mother about the food, about the cold, never about fear. Fear had no place in letters. She wrote back, telling him the dog had dug up the garden again, that his father had repaired the shed roof, that things were quiet. Uniforms came 2 weeks later, woolen, scratchy, stiff. The boots were too small, then too big, then somehow always wrong. The cap didn't quite fit, but they wore them anyway. They stood in rows, buttons gleaming, and stared into nothing. They saluted walls, trees, empty space. Practice. Then came the firing range. Real bullets, real noise. The rifles kicked like angry animals. Ears rang for hours. Targets were simple wooden boards. No faces, no names, just distant X's. Thomas shot carefully, not fast, not eager, just enough. Marching continued. Rain didn't stop it. Mud didn't stop it. Blisters didn't stop it. Socks were thin. Soles peeled. Feet bled. No one complained. Complaining meant peeling potatoes, cleaning toilets, scrubbing floors with a toothbrush. One boy, barely 18, passed out. Mid-drill, they dragged him to the side, poured water on his face, and kept going. No one asked about him the next day. Thomas learned to sleep without dreams. Just darkness. Just the feeling of weight leaving his chest, then waking to the same ceiling again. They were issued gas masks next. Heavy, awkward things that smelled like burnt rubber. They practiced putting them on. Fast. Faster. In less than 10 seconds. Or again. And again. The sirens were fake, but the drills were not. This is life now, the sergeant said. Or death. Rations became thinner. Bread, canned meat. Sometimes something green. Always tea. Weak tea. The kind that looked like old water. Thomas sipped it slowly. Warmth mattered more than taste. Days blurred. They memorized numbers, codes, orders. They learned to strip a rifle in 30 seconds, to tie a knot blindfolded, to identify a plane by its sound. Sleep came when it was allowed, sometimes not at all. Then came the orders. Deployment. No one shouted. No one cheered. They just packed. Slowly, quietly. Letters were sent again. Going soon, Thomas wrote. Don't worry. His mother's reply came too late to read. They boarded the ship with bags over shoulders and helmets too tight. The sea smelled strange, and the deck tilted with every step. Some men turned green. Some leaned over rails. Thomas just sat, staring at the horizon that didn't move. The bunks below were tighter than the barracks. Air was thick. The engine rumbled like a beast that never slept. They were told not to ask where they were headed, only that it would be cold and loud. They reached shore in the dark. No lights, just voices guiding them down ramps. Mud sucked at their boots. The sky smelled like fire even when there wasn't one. Trucks took them to fields, then to tents, then to nowhere. That's what the war felt like, nowhere. Endless fields, endless waiting. The guns hadn't fired yet, but their backs already ached. Their boots were wet before morning, their gloves soaked by noon. Thomas didn't speak much. He listened to the rustle of wind in tarp, to the cough of the man beside him, to the way silence stretched between moments like thread. And when the first gunshot came, it didn't sound like glory. It sounded like thunder far away, like the world remembering something terrible. But even then, the worst part wasn't the sound. It was the waiting that came after. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It came sideways from the north, pushed by a wind that cut through wool and bone. The tents sagged, then leaked. Puddles formed beneath cots. Boots sat in lines filled with water. Socks never dried. A man named Ellis tried to start a fire using damp matches, but the smoke choked them before any warmth arrived. They gave up and sat under wet blankets, shivering in silence. The first march began on a Wednesday. No one remembered what date. They were told to pack light, then handed more than they could carry. Rifles, rations, a shovel, a blanket, a helmet, gas mask, ammunition belt, extra socks. Some packed a book, a photo, small tin of tobacco. Thomas took only the photo. His mother standing near the shed, hands in her apron. No smile, just eyes that understood something deeper than words. They walked all day. No destination was mentioned. The road curved, then vanished into mud. Trees stood, like watching figures, unmoving, dripping. The pack straps bit into shoulders. Feet blistered. Knees throbbed. Some sang quietly, tuneless things, just to keep rhythm. Others muttered curses between breaths. At night, they stopped in a hollow field near a small village, long abandoned. The chimneys were black, the windows shattered. No light came from the houses, just the echo of the wind pushing through broken doors. They laid their gear on damp grass and waited. The officer barked a few words about holding here until further orders. That was all. They dug, slowly, awkwardly, with frozen fingers and clumsy spades. Trenches weren't trenches at first, just shallow lines in the ground, filling with water faster than they could clear them. By midnight, their knees were submerged. By dawn, their legs were numb. Breakfast came in tins. Cold beans, hard bread. Some received spam, sliced thick and gray. Tea was poured from a rusted kettle. It steamed briefly before cooling to lukewarm. No one spoke. The only sound was metal on metal. The orders changed. They were told to move again, 10 miles east, then 10 more. The ground was flatter there, but open to open. No trees, no rocks, just wind and sky. They were told to dig again, deeper this time, wider. They worked in silence, the shovel scraping roots, the dirt caking beneath nails. At night, they huddled in twos beneath tarps. The stars hid behind clouds. One man whispered a prayer. Another cursed at fleas. Thomas lay still, hands tucked in his sleeves, eyes open. He imagined his bed at home, the warmth of it, the creak of the old frame. He imagined the sound of rain on the tin roof. Here, there was only the sound of breathing and distant thunder. Training had not prepared them for the silence, the cold, the repetition. Mornings began with roll call. Names barked. Responses mumbled, then rations, then patrol, then drills, then back to the trench. The same shovel, the same mud, the same numb fingers. One morning, boy named Finch didn't wake. No gunfire, no injury, just cold. The medics wrapped him in his blanket and carried him away. His name was not spoken again. They received leaflets about the enemy. Black and white photos of men with sharp eyes and hard expressions. They were told what uniforms to look for, what insignias to memorize. They passed the paper between them, then used it to light the fire when the wood ran out. The first sound of gunfire near their camp came at dusk, sharp, quick, distant. A crack like the sky tearing. The officer told them to stay low. No return fire, no movement, just wait. So they waited. For hours. Thomas stared at his boots. One lace had snapped. He tied it back together 3 times. The trenches deepened with time. Boards were laid to keep the mud at bay. It helped for a day or two. Then the rain returned. They used sandbags, then tin sheets. Still, the water seeped in. Letters arrived from home once a month. Some men received none. Those who did opened them carefully, holding the paper like it might tear from memory alone. Thomas's letter spoke of ration lines, of blackout curtains, of the dog running away. His mother mentioned nothing about fear. He didn't either when he wrote back. Night patrols began after the third week. 2 men, 1 lantern, 10-minute rotations along the edge of camp. The fields were silent except for the rustle of grass and the occasional creak of a fence long rotted. Footsteps in mud were the only sound they made. Thomas once walked with Ellis, who talked about the smell of coal back home, said he missed it, said it reminded him of December. Occasionally, they were issued orders to fire into the distance. No target, just shots into the dark. To keep pressure up, they loaded, aimed, fired. The recoil was familiar now, the noise, dull. Thomas fired his 5 rounds and then waited for the next order. None came. Lice became a problem. It started with itching, then scratching, then open sores. They were told to wash with cold water and lie. It helped briefly, then returned. 1 man shaved his head. Another burned his blanket. Toilets were nothing more than holes in the ground, shielded by thin cloth. The wind didn't care. The cold was constant. Privacy was forgotten. 1 man slipped in the mud near the latrine and broke his wrist. He was sent back. No one replaced him. Each day bled into the next. The same drills, the same patrol, the same fear without form. The enemy existed, but distant. Shadows, rumors, shots in the night, never close. That, they were told, was the worst kind of war, the waiting kind. Their boots fell apart. Some men wrapped their feet in cloth. Others borrowed spares. The medic handed out ointment like candy, though it did little. Thomas's toes were red, swollen. He pretended not to notice. One afternoon, they heard planes overhead. At first, just a hum, then louder, then engines like thunder. They ducked, but no bombs fell, just the roar of machines moving east. Practice, someone said. Or maybe not. No one checked. Weeks passed. Supplies thinned. Meals became smaller, sometimes just broth. Once, moldy bread. Still, they ate. Hunger dulled other senses. Thomas felt it in his joints, in the back of his skull. A constant pull downward. The sergeant changed. The old one disappeared without word. The new one shouted more, but meant less. His orders repeated like a song, stuck on a single verse. Dig, march, load, wait. Once, Thomas caught a fever. Not high, not dangerous, just enough to make his head heavy. He didn't report it, just sat slower, walked slower, waited for it to pass. It did, eventually. Like everything else, a rumor spread about an upcoming movement, bigger than the last, a real one, a front line. No one knew where, no one asked. They just packed again, folded their tarps, cleaned their rifles, counted their rations, waited for trucks. The night before they left, someone tried to sing. The voice cracked, others joined, then stopped. Thomas sat with his boots off, rubbing his feet. The stars were out for once, cold and clear. When the trucks came, they loaded in silence. The engines groaned. The road ahead looked the same as all others. Dirt, rocks, mud, sky. But something in the air had changed. The silence was thinner now, like it was holding its breath. And so they moved. Again, Thomas sat between Ellis and another man whose name he never learned. The canvas flapped above their heads. The rifle rested against his leg. The road stretched on, and the war waited somewhere just beyond the bend. The truck ride lasted 8 hours, maybe more. No one checked the time. Watches had stopped working weeks ago, too damp, too broken. Thomas sat with his knees touching the knees of the man across from him. Neither spoke. The truck bed rocked. With each bump, a rhythm that numbed the spine and rattled the teeth. Dust blew in under the tarp. It coated their lips, gathered in the corners of their eyes, and filled their nostrils. When they arrived, no one cheered. They climbed down, stretched aching backs, and stood on ground just as cold and muddy as the place they'd left. The camp was new, but not better. Barbed wire curled lazily along the outer perimeter, rusted and snagged on itself. There were more men here, too many. Rows of tents filled with strangers who all looked the same, gray uniforms, hollow eyes, silent hands. Thomas was assigned to tent 12. He found a corner, caught and dropped his bag, then sat. The canvas above him sagged with damp, stained from old rain. Someone snored nearby. Someone coughed. A match struck, and a cigarette lit briefly before fading back into shadow. Dinner that night was soup. Thin, cabbage, or something like it. Saltless. Hot enough to fog the tin cup, not hot enough to matter. Bread so hard it had to be soaked first. They ate on crates, on logs, on the ground. Men slurped and stared. No one asked names. No one introduced themselves. The war was too far along for that now. Morning arrived with shouting, as usual. New orders, more drills, a different sergeant. This one with a voice like gravel and a limp that made a step uneven. On your feet, he said. Formation in 5. No one moved quickly, but they moved. They always did. Marching again. 10 miles this time. Full gear. They passed through woods, fields, past a burned farmhouse where a rusted plow leaned against blackened walls. Thomas stared at it as they passed, wondering who had once used it, who had left it behind. The path narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again. Roots twisted underfoot. Some men stumbled. No one laughed. They arrived at another trench line deeper, wider, reinforced with timber. This was the front, or near enough. It looked like every other trench, except the sandbags were stacked higher, and the walls had names carved into them. Dozens of them, some fresh, some worn away by rain and fingers. They were told to hold position, watch the tree line, stay quiet, no fires, no noise. After dark, Thomas settled into a post near the edge, a small shelf of dirt with just enough space for his legs and his rifle. The ground was cold, the air still. He stared at the trees. Nothing moved. That night, a shell landed a mile away. They felt the ground shudder. No one flinched. They just looked up briefly, then returned to their silence. Thomas couldn't tell if the war was close or far anymore. It just was. Like the weather, like hunger, the days repeated. Patrol, watch, rest, eat, wait. The trench became home. They built shelves into the mud, laid planks across the floor. One man made a stool out of scrap wood. Another tied string to a nail and made a line for drying socks. It helped a little. They were told not to sleep too deeply, not to remove boots, not to stand too high, not to speak too loudly. The rules, stacked like sandbags, heavy, damp, always present. Thomas memorized them without effort. They became reflex. Rats arrived by the dozens. Fat, bold, unafraid. They chewed through packs, gnawed boots, climbed over sleeping men. One man tried to kill one with a spade. Missed. Laughed once. Then didn't laugh again. The mail stopped coming. No one explained why. Maybe the route had changed. Maybe there was nothing left to write. Men stared at the same letters over and over, folded them, unfolded them. Thomas kept his in a tin, dry, safe, even if he couldn't read it anymore. In the dark, one afternoon, A man to posts down fired his rifle. Once, twice, then stopped. Silence followed. No one asked why. The sergeant came, looked, then nodded and left. The man said nothing, just sat back down and resumed watching the trees. Rain. Again. The trench filled. Water to the knees. They bailed with helmets, with mess tins, with their hands. Then gave up. Just stood there, soaked. One man sang quietly, a tune with no words. It didn't help. They were given new masks. Heavier, bulkier, better protection, they were told. They practiced putting them on in 6 seconds flat. Even in sleep, even blindfolded. They kept them nearby, always. Some tied them to their legs, others to their chests. No one wanted to be without one when it came. The first casualty in Thomas's squad came during a supply run. A mine, hidden, sudden. He didn't scream, just disappeared in a sound that left ears ringing. They buried what they could find. Not much. Someone carved a name into a board and stuck it in the mud. It fell over by morning. After that, they stopped naming things. Trenches, foxholes, posts, graves. Everything blurred into earth and silence. The rations changed. Less meat, more biscuits. Tea became rare. Cigarettes became currency. 1 cigarette could trade for 2 spoonfuls of sugar, or a half bar of soap, or silence. New men arrived. Replacements. Younger, skinnier, faces still soft. They asked questions, got few answers. They stood wrong, spoke too loud, slept too deeply. Thomas watched them, remembering when he had been one of them. Not anymore. There were drills still. Pointless, it seemed. Marches through nowhere. Target practice at nothing. But they kept doing them. Because order mattered. Because stillness was worse. Letters resumed. Short. Few. Thomas got one. It was dated months ago. His mother said she'd sewn new curtains. That the baker's son had been conscripted. That the postman now wore a helmet. Nothing about the war. Nothing about fear. Thomas didn't reply. Didn't know what to say. Nights grew colder. Frost on the edges of the trench. The wind cut deeper. Gloves tore. Socks rotted. Fingers cracked. They were issued wool scarves. Scratchy. Gray. No warmth, but something. One man drew on the trench wall with charcoal. A bird. Its wings stretched wide. No one asked why. No one erased it. They began to hear shells more often. Not close, but louder. A rhythm, like distant thunder, sometimes followed by smoke on the horizon, sometimes not. The officer told them it was time to move again. A new line, closer, deeper. No one reacted. They packed, folded their tarps, checked their rifles, waited for trucks. When the trucks didn't come, they marched. At night, through fields slick with frost, through woods that whispered, they walked in single file, silent, shadows with boots. They reached the new position before dawn. It wasn't better, just different. A longer trench, narrower, sheltered by a ridge, mud already knee-deep. No boards this time, just shovels, just arms. They began again, digging, watching, waiting. The trench grew deeper each day, not because they wanted it deeper, but because the water never left. Each time, they cleared a bucket of slush. More seeped up through the earth, as if the ground itself resented them. They worked in shifts, 2 hours digging, 2 hours on watch, 2 hours trying to sleep with boots still on. The rest of the time was spent waiting for mail, for orders, for dry socks. Thomas kept his fingers moving when he wasn't digging, clenching and unclenching them to stop the cold from stiffening the joints. He'd lost feeling in his left pinky sometime around the 5th night. It hadn't returned. The latrine was little more than a pit behind a collapsed tree, surrounded by scraps of tin for cover. It stank always, no matter the wind. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew it by smell alone. A man slipped there one night and injured his ankle. He limped for days until he was taken away on a stretcher. No one saw him again. Shelling resumed. Sporadic, never near, but loud enough to set their nerves humming. They learned to tell the type by sound. Long whistles meant artillery, short cracks meant mortars. When the sky flashed red on the horizon, Thomas didn't look anymore. The light showed nothing new. They built small shelves in the mud walls, with whatever wood they could find. Some placed mugs or small photographs there. Others stored candles, matches, tin openers. A few carved initials. Thomas carved nothing. Their uniforms never dried. When they stripped off layers at night, they did so carefully, as if removing someone else's skin. The wool steamed when held to the fire, but never fully warm. The moment it was back on, it felt like frost returned with it. One morning, they were issued helmets with new netting. For camouflage, the officer said. No one asked why, or what had changed. They tied bits of brush into the netting anyway, of habit more than strategy. At night, the brush froze. The trench rats grew more bold. Some climbed into sleeping bags. Others chewed through ration boxes. One even stole a sock. The men tried traps, buckets, sharpened sticks, baited bits of bread, but the rats were smarter, faster. One night, Thomas woke to find one staring at him from his pack. He didn't move. Neither did the rat. It blinked and disappeared. They were told to brace for winter. Heavier coats arrived, stiff things that smelled like dust and old wool. Better than nothing, but only just. Along with them came tin stoves, one per squad. Not for heat, just for warming fingers enough to hold. Rifles. They huddled around them in shifts, eyes half closed, pretending the warmth lasted longer than a few minutes. Supplies came irregularly now. Some weeks brought fresh bread. Other weeks, nothing but tins and dried biscuits. Once, they received a bag of onions. No one knew why. They boiled them, sliced them raw, even chewed them whole just to remember taste. A medic passed through once a week. He checked feet, wrapped cuts, listened to chests with an old, dented stethoscope. "Keep dry," he said. Always. Everyone laughed dryly. In the fourth week, the fog arrived. It settled low, dense, a woolen wall that turned the world into shadows. Patrols were shortened. Visibility dropped. A man went missing. They found his cap, nothing more. The officer marked it down in a book, then closed it. One man, Patterson, tried to light a fire too large. It caught the edge of a tarp and melted the corner of the trench wall. No one was hurt, but the sergeant made them rebuild the wall by hand. Mud, sandbags, boards. It took 2 days. Patterson said nothing. They passed time in quiet ways. Some whittled sticks. Some played with buttons, flipping them like coins. A man named Green kept a diary, or so he said. No one saw him write, but he guarded a small leather book like treasure. Thomas once asked what he wrote in it. Green replied, "I'll remember if I write." Forgetting would be too easy. Thomas thought forgetting sounded better. Each evening, the light faded without warning. One moment gray, the next black. They moved slower then. Voices softer, faces blurred into outlines. Watches glowed faintly. Thomas watched his breath drift out and vanish, over and over. The mail arrived late one day, handed out by a private, with shaking hands. Thomas's letter was from 2 months prior. His mother mentioned rain in the village, a leak in the kitchen roof, a quietness in the air. No news from the bakery, just small things, normal things. He folded the letter slowly, pressed it into the same tin. Didn't write back. Their watches changed. 2 hours at a time, rotating. Standing in the cold, staring into fog, ears straining for sounds that never came. Sometimes they saw lights, flickers, flares. No one knew if it was enemy movement or just tricks of weather. They reported it anyway. The mud climbed higher with each day. It clung to shins, dried like plaster, then cracked. Some men lost boots trying to pull free. Others tied rope around their ankles just to keep them on. Frostbite took 2 toes from a man named Dalton. He didn't scream, just looked down, shook his head, and said, "Guess that's that." The medic wrapped his foot and called for a stretcher. Dalton waved as they took him. "Warm socks next time," he said. No one replied. A new trench was dug, parallel to the old one 20 feet back. They were told it was for fallback, just in case. They dug anyway. That's all they ever did. Dig, wait, dig again. The shelling returned, closer this time. Dirt shook from the trench walls. Helmets rattled. One blast hit the edge of the camp. Killed a tree. No men. Still, they stayed low for hours after, speaking in whispers, eyes to the sky. One man collapsed from exhaustion during a patrol, fell face first into the mud. They picked him up, dusted him off, walked him back. No one scolded him. They all understood. They began to count days in tins. 1 tin per day, sometimes 2. Thomas had 13 stacked beside his shelf, then 15, then 20. He stopped counting. After 30, the fog lifted briefly. The sun appeared, watery and low, casting weak shadows over the trench. Some men stood still, just feeling it. No words, no cheers, just skin on light. But by evening, the clouds returned, the cold with it. The war never moved far, always just out of reach, yet always present, like breath, like hunger. When the sergeant announced another movement, no one blinked, just folded blankets, cleaned rifles, packed tins, the same routine, the same weight, different mud. Thomas tightened his pack straps, adjusted his scarf, looked once more at the shelf with the tin and the letter, then turned to another trench, another line. The war went on, slow and endless, like a story whispered in a room where no one could sleep. They had been waiting at the coastal staging area for what felt like an eternity. The air smelled of salt and rust, as steel containers clanged hollowly in the background and trucks groaned under the weight of supplies that never seemed to move. The soldiers' orders had come through a week prior, but there was always some delay, some mechanical fault, some new piece of bureaucracy that needed stamping or signatures before anyone could board the transport ship. Private Thompson had learned not to ask questions. Days now blurred together, beginning and ending with the same lukewarm powdered eggs and dull drills on the wet gravel of the dockyard perimeter. The barracks were converted storage buildings, drafty and dimly lit. The wooden beams overhead creaked with every gust of ocean wind, and water ran in rivulets down the stone walls whenever it rained, which it did often. There was little to do. Cards had long since lost their novelty. Thompson would sit on his cot, legs dangling, peeling the wax off the tips of matches with the pocket knife he'd managed to hold onto through inspections. Sometimes he would write in a notebook pages filled with useless notes about the sounds the floorboards made, the pattern of condensation on the window near his bed, the way one of the sergeants always cleared his throat before speaking. The days were empty, the nights long, and the only constant was the endless list of things that still needed doing before they could ship out. Final vaccinations, inventory checks, footlocker inspections, and mandatory briefings that all seemed to say the same thing over and over. Don't lose your weapon. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't expect to sleep much. When the ship finally arrived, no announcement was made. Instead, one morning, they were roused earlier than usual. The voice of the staff sergeant was hoarser than normal, as though the salt air had finally carved through it. "Pack it. You've got 20 minutes. The ship looked less like a military vessel and more like a rusting cargo hauler. Painted gray, with smudged cereals and patched hulls. It leaned ever so slightly in the water, the bow creaking as it accepted the first pallets of crates. Thompson and the others filed aboard, carrying their packs, rifles, and the layered weight of anticipation. Below deck, things were worse. The quarters were cramped and dark. Rows of hammocks swung between metal beams, close enough that if one man turned, everyone turned. The air was damp, filled with the smell of oil, sea salt, and tightly packed bodies. There were no portholes. There was barely any light. The engine's hum never stopped. For the first 2 days, the sea was calm. Meals were served: cold bread, tinned meat, and powdered drinks that always seemed to taste like chalk. There was no privacy. Shaving was done shoulder to shoulder. The latrines overflowed more than once. Thompson learned to time his visits precisely after cleaning cycles. Most of the men were quiet, passing the time with the hollow-eyed patience that came only with prolonged boredom. A few still talked in hopeful tones about France, about action, about making a difference. Those voices grew quieter by the hour. On the 3rd day, the waves picked up. Thompson had never been at sea. At first, it was only a rolling sensation, gentle but constant. Then it became more severe. Hammocks swayed violently. Plates slid off mess hall tables. Vomit slicked the stairwells. The air grew hotter, thicker. Water leaked from unknown sources, and sleeping was nearly impossible. Every surface was metal. Every sound a harsh echo. By the 5th day, most were sick. Thompson clutched a tin bucket he refused to let go of, even after it had been used several times. His head throbbed endlessly. There was no land in sight, only the faint comfort of the ceiling-mounted bulbs flickering dimly in the dark belly of the ship. Each one of those lights, to him, became like a star far away, unchanging, and impossible to touch. There were drills even at sea. Once a day, they were ordered topside in full gear for formation exercises. The wind was bitter and wet, and the deck pitched unpredictably. It was less about practice and more about control, making sure no one got too soft, even if they could barely stand upright. One man collapsed on the 3rd day of drills. They carried him below and nobody mentioned it again. Eventually, land appeared, just a shadow in the mist, cliffs rising like ancient teeth from the water. They didn't disembark for hours. Thompson sat near the stairwell, holding his helmet between his knees, trying to ignore the creak and sway of the ship. When the command finally came, it was silent chaos. The crew shouted over one another. Orders were barked, repeated, and misheard. The men stumbled down narrow gangplanks onto the gravelly beach, the crunch beneath their boots sounding like thunder after the muffled hum of the ship. The air was colder than expected. A coastal wind bit through the wool of their uniforms, and clouds hung low, offering drizzle, but never full rain. Trucks awaited, canvas covered, smelling of fuel and age. The ride inland was slow. The roads were muddy and poorly maintained, winding through villages that were barely more than smudges on a map. Every hour, the convoy stopped for cows, for repairs, for reasons not explained. Soldiers sat in silence, backs against crates, occasionally passing around the same canteen of tepid water. The field stretched out endlessly: brown, gray, pale green. Thompson counted fence posts. 137 between the 2nd and 3rd stops. By the time they arrived at the new encampment, the sun had set. What passed for a base was a cluster of tents and shacks, ranged haphazardly in a field that had once been farmland. Mud sucked at boots. Lights buzzed faintly. Everything was wet. The tents leaked. The cots were too short. The heaters didn't work. Thompson sat on the edge of his bedding, staring at a lantern's shadow against the wall, and wondering if the mud would ever dry. He doubted it. He hadn't felt properly dry since the day they left shore. That night, The cold was sharp enough to keep everyone from sleeping. Someone somewhere coughed all night. Another man muttered in his sleep about letters he never mailed. Thompson lay still, eyes open, counting the seconds between the buzzing flicker of the overhead light. He would not remember falling asleep, only the dreams of endless marching through mud, and the aching emptiness that followed. Morning came, not with a bugle, but with the staff sergeant kicking the base of each cot and muttering, "Rise and shine." It was a joke. They queued for rations, gray porridge, half-frozen bread, weak coffee. Then came orders: set up perimeter, dig latrines, reinforce the outer trench lines. The war hadn't come to them yet, but they were told to prepare like it would any minute. Digging was the worst of it. The ground was half frozen, the shovels dull. Every scoop of soil felt like a punishment. They worked in silence, sleeves soaked and fingers raw. A man nearby named Keller had a cough that wouldn't stop. Another, Marks, had already developed trench foot. Nobody said anything. Days passed, each one identical. Wake, eat, dig, wait. The only sounds were boots and mud, distant birds, the occasional radio static from command tents. Sometimes they trained with rifles, aiming at wooden targets that never moved. Sometimes they wrote letters they couldn't send. Thompson wrote 3 pages to no one. He folded the paper and placed it under his mattress. Evenings brought only the distant sound of generators and the sharp scent of burnt rations. He tried to sleep, but the wind never stopped. Neither did the chill. He began to forget what warm felt like. One morning, they were told to pack again. Another move, another field, another stretch of waiting, digging, watching. The war, it seemed, was always just a few miles further, always just ahead, and they were always just behind it, dragging their boots through mud, counting fence posts, wondering if they would ever catch up. The morning started before the sun could be seen. A cold breeze crept into the cracks of the barracks like a patient whisper, curling around the thin wool blankets and settling onto the faces of men who were already half awake. The soldier opened, his eyes slowly, not from rest, but from habit. He blinked the crust of poor sleep from his lashes and sat up stiffly. Every movement met with the mild ache that had long since become familiar. He did not speak. Nobody did. He pulled on the same pair of trousers he had worn yesterday and the day before that. The fabric was thinning near the knees and reeked faintly of dampness and old grease. His boots, still caked with dried earth from the field marched 3 days ago, gave a reluctant creak as he forced his feet into them. The mess hall was silent, filled only with the clatter of metal spoons on enamel bowls. Breakfast was the same. Again slightly sweet porridge, too thin to be called hearty, and a chunk of dark bread so dense it needed to be softened by dunking. A few men sipped weak coffee, its surface ringed with bits of floating grit. There was no conversation. No one asked questions. They had all been answered in previous weeks. After breakfast came the drill, marching exercises, weapons cleaning, bayonet practice on straw dummies. The soldier's hands were dry, cracked at the knuckles, and when he gripped the rifle, it stuck slightly to his skin. He did not remember a time when his hands didn't hurt, or when the rifle felt like anything other than an extension of labor. The officers walked among the rows, barking commands with hoarse voices that had shouted too many times across too many mornings. A correction here, rebuke there. Nothing unusual, nothing new. When the drills ended, there was a pause before the afternoon inspections. Some soldiers smoked, others sat on crates and stared at nothing. The soldier sat beneath a corrugated tin roof, its edge dripping with melted frost. He took out a small photograph from his chest pocket, a picture of his younger sister, taken 3 years ago, before the war. It was already smudged at the edges, softened by his thumb. He did not smile. He merely looked, Letting his eyes rest on something not shaped like camouflage or wire, inspection began, with boots lined by beds, rifles dismantled and polished on blankets, belts laid straight with buckles gleaming. Officers moved down the line with silent intensity, nodding, moving on. The soldiers' gear passed without comment. That was the goal, not praise, but avoidance of remark. Later, the rations were distributed. Tinned meat, biscuits, something vaguely green in a jar. The meat tasted of tin. The biscuits were hard enough to require soaking. There was no schedule for warmth, no expectation of comfort. The food served its only purpose to delay hunger. For another few hours. By evening, the air had turned to frost. Breath lingered in the barracks like fog. The soldier rubbed his arms beneath his coat. The stove, centrally placed, but rarely burning, stood silent. Coal was ration. Fire was a luxury. He lay down on his cot, drawing the blanket around him with slow, practiced movements. Across the room, a man coughed into his sleeve, the sound wet and unending. No one responded. Coughing was part of the nightly atmosphere, like wind or the sound of distant boots. There was a knock outside, 3 short raps, then silence, then again. A patrol rotation. The soldier sat up again, pulling on his boots, tucking his cuffs into his socks. He reached for his helmet. The night air outside was unforgiving. Stars shimmered above the treetops, sharp and distant, uncaring. He walked the perimeter in silence, 1 foot in front of the other, rifle slung low across his shoulder. The wire fence cast long shadows in the moonlight. The mud squelched beneath his soles, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. The soldier did not flinch. He just kept walking, just as he had yesterday, and as he would tomorrow. No new thought formed in his mind, only the old ones, worn smooth by repetition. When his shift ended, he returned to his cot and lay back down. Boots off once more. He did not dream. He simply waited for the next morning to arrive, because it always did, and always looked exactly like the last. The barracks smelled faintly of wool and metal. It was a dry sort of odor, not unpleasant, just ever-present. The floorboards, rough and uneven, creaked predictably under each bootstep. The soldier rose before the bugle, not because he wanted to, but because his body now woke at the same time every day, regardless of alarm or fatigue. He sat on the edge of his cot, lacing his boots in silence. A few others were already awake, pulling on jackets and adjusting their belts without words. Outside, the early light hadn't yet broken through the mist. It hung low over the camp like breath trapped in a glass jar. Boots hit the gravel yard in steady rhythm as morning muster began. The officer's voice was firm but subdued. Not angry, just efficient. Roll call proceeded. Names ticked off without delay. Those absent had already been noted the day before for various reasons: fever, wounds, reassignment. The soldier stood with his rifle across his chest, mind blank, eyes forward. Drills followed the roll call. Not the vigorous kind of training one sees in film, but slow, routine, and repetitive motions, marching in circles, stopping, turning, marching again. Then weapon checks. The soldier's fingers moved automatically now, dismantling the rifle, piece by piece, cleaning each part with soft cloth and oil. The barrel was cold in his hands. The scent of gun oil had become a part of his memory, something as stable and familiar as rain. After the drills came the midday meal. A long queue formed outside the mess hut, steam curling from metal pots at the serving table. The soldier was handed a ladle of thin cabbage soup and a chunk of dry, slightly stale bread. He sat on an overturned crate near a cluster of others, dipping the bread into the lukewarm soup with small, measured bites. There was no conversation. Nobody commented on the food, because doing so wouldn't change it. Later in the day, they were marched to the edge of the forest for reconnaissance. Practice. This part, though equally quiet, felt different. There was always tension in the woods. The soldiers spread out, eyes scanning for movement, rifles held close but not raised. Every twig that snapped beneath a boot brought a small twitch of awareness. The soldier moved through the trees, heart calm, but breath slowed, senses sharpened. Not by adrenaline, but by training. He spotted a flag tied to a low branch, marked it in his notebook, and moved on. Nothing happened, and that was good. When they returned, it was already late afternoon. The sky, a pale gray blanket, grew darker at the edges. The soldier wiped his boots clean with a rag, hung his rifle on the wall, and stepped into the barracks. To wait. There was always waiting. Sometimes they were waiting for orders, sometimes for mail. Most of the time, it wasn't clear what they were waiting for, just that the waiting was part of the day. As evening settled in, letters were distributed fewer than usual. A corporal walked down the row of bunks, calling names in a tired voice. The soldier did not receive a letter, but the man beside him did, and read it with his head bent low, his lips barely moving. No one asked what the letter said. No one interrupted. Letters were private, even in the barracks, even among friends. Lights out came early. The soldier lay on his cot again, arms behind his head, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above. Someone was snoring softly. Another muttered in his sleep. The stove rattled faintly, its embers casting a dull orange glow on the far wall. The soldier closed his eyes. He was not thinking of anything in particular. He was simply letting the day slide backward into his memory, where it would settle like all the other identical days before it. Tomorrow would come again, with its boots and drills, soup and letters, rifles and trees. He would rise, lace his boots, and join the line once more, not because he believed in anything, but because this was now his shape, his pattern. And patterns are hard to break. The days began to blur, not in chaos, but in their sameness. There was something almost soft about the repetition, waking at the same hour, tightening the same belt, holding the same rifle with the same calloused hands. It dulled the edge of fear. It numbed even the memory of change. Snow had started falling the previous night. Not a heavy, storybook snowfall, but a thin, persistent flurry that layered the camp in quiet. Footsteps left dark prints in white powder. Breath fogged in short bursts. The latrine buckets had frozen at the edges. The soldier rubbed his hands together as he exited the barracks, but the warmth never quite came. The cold was the kind that wasn't bitter or biting, just permanent. Morning inspection was longer today. The officer walked slowly, checking boots and belts and weapons more closely than usual. There were no complaints, no signs of impatience. The men stood in line like fence posts. A few had minor infractions, buttons missed, straps loose, but the corrections were done silently, quickly. Nobody wanted attention. Attention could lead to reassignment. After inspection, a truck arrived. Its tires cracked over the frosted gravel, carrying crates of supplies, ammunition, canned food, new uniforms still stiff from storage. The soldier helped unload, stacking boxes in the storage tent. The gloves he wore were too thin, but he didn't bother to complain. Each box felt the same, weighty and cold. Occasionally one would rattle with loose bullets or thump with heavy tins of beans. The sun rose halfway, and then began to fall again, barely completing its arc. The soldier spent the midday hours doing rifle maintenance with the cloth and wire brush. Oil was scarce, but he'd learned to stretch it. One drop went a long way when you knew how to spread it evenly. The rifle's bolt stuck slightly when cold, so he cycled it slowly, working the stiffness out. An officer came by around dusk with a map. He didn't explain much, just pointed. A patrol route, short, quiet. The soldier was chosen along with 3 others. They dressed quickly, strapped their rifles tight, and set out along the tree line. Their boots crunched softly over frozen earth. No one spoke. They walked as if they'd always been walking. The route led them along a narrow trench line, mostly filled in with snow. Barbed wire framed the trail in parts, sagging under frost. They paused periodically, scanned the tree line, checked for tracks or signs of movement. There were none. The woods were utterly still, just bare branches, brittle grass, and the occasional caw of a crow overhead. The soldier knelt once to examine a footprint. It was old, partially iced over, but he marked it anyway, just in case. His fingers stiffened quickly once exposed. When he stood, his knees ached from the cold. Nothing dramatic happened. They continued walking, eventually turning back after an hour, reporting nothing. That was good. Nothing was always good. Back at camp, dinner was rice and a few slices of tinned meat. The soldier ate slowly, chewing each bite as if stretching it. Conversation remained minimal. One man asked for extra salt. Another traded his meat for bread. No jokes, no stories. Just scraping spoons and the sound of metal cups clinking faintly. That night, the wind picked up. The barracks creaked at the seams. Some men slept with coats on. Others curled tight under coarse blankets, faces buried. The stove hissed low, struggling against the draft. The soldier stayed awake a little longer, staring at the wallboards, watching the way shadows shifted from the flickering firelight. His hands were dry and cracked, nails rimmed with dirt. He thought about home, not in detail, just the shape of it, the front step, the curve of the road outside, the chair near the window. He didn't miss it in the way stories say. It was more like remembering a dream and not knowing what part was real. When he finally closed his eyes, sleep came without effort. It always did now. He didn't dream anymore, or if he did, he couldn't recall it. Morning would return, and he would rise, and his boots would creak, and the frost would sting, and his rifle would still be slightly too cold. The war hadn't changed that much in this place. No bombs, no charges, no cries. Just waiting, marching, cleaning, eating, and sleeping. Brutal not in bursts, but in the wear of time, the erosion of identity, the grinding sameness of days that stretched endlessly forward. The wind howled through the broken trees as winter settled into its grim position along the eastern front. Snow fell endlessly, coating everything in a dull, frozen white that masked the churned-up earth and bodies hidden beneath it. The soldier, now months into his deployment, could no longer remember what warm skin felt like. His gloves had long worn through, and his fingers, wrapped in dirty cloth strips, trembled as he adjusted his rifle sling. Each breath came out in a visible puff, dissipating like hope into the bleak expanse. The trenches had evolved, or rather, devolved into deep furrows filled with sludge and ice. Where once the soldier might have felt fear at the sound of distant artillery, he now merely registered it as background noise. The mind adapts when it must. The booming of shells, the whine of mortars, and the endless, low rumble of tanks had become part of the symphony of war, the soundtrack to his monotonous days. Food was a joke. Cans of stewed meat, hard bread that could chip teeth, and a tasteless powder mixed with water and called soup. The men no longer complained. Complaints wasted energy. Rations came inconsistently, and he had learned not to ask when they'd come. Next, hunger had become a dull ache, always present, like the raw blistering on his feet or the persistent lice in his clothing. Washing was impossible. He had not changed socks in 3 weeks. His uniform smelled of sweat, rot, and the faint chemical bitterness of explosives. But no one noticed. Everyone smelled the same. They had transcended vanity. Their appearance had become uniform, unshaven, gaunt, dirty. Faces faded into one another. He often stared at the frozen ground, imagining the lives buried beneath. He knew of soldiers who had been swallowed by sudden shell blasts, whose remains were irretrievable. Others had been shot and left behind in no man's land, unreachable without a suicide mission. Sometimes, in the eerie silence before dawn, he thought he could hear them whispering, half memory, half madness. Letters from home arrived occasionally, passed down the line like sacred relics. He had received 2 since arriving. The first had made him cry. The second he could not bear to open. It sat folded in the inner pocket of his coat, damp from his sweat and the snow that occasionally leaked through his collar. His mother's handwriting haunted him more than enemy bullets. Sleep had become an uncertain companion. When he could, he drifted into short, uneasy slumber, always half conscious of his surroundings. Dreams, when they came, were vivid and strange. Sometimes they were of home, a table set for dinner, his younger brother laughing in the summer sun. Other times they were warped, terrifying sequences. Mud that swallowed him whole, ice staring from the forest, blood that refused to stop flowing. The men around him were shadows of themselves. There was Corporal Braun, whose right hand shook so badly he could no longer fire his weapon. No one had the heart to report it. There was Meyer, who hadn't spoken in 3 days after finding the bodies of 2 of his childhood friends frozen together in a ditch. The lieutenant kept pretending everything was under control, that orders would come, that relief was around the corner, but his voice had lost conviction. The days blurred. Morning was indistinguishable from afternoon. Evenings were marked only by the dimming light and the increased fear of night raids. The cold became unbearable after sundown, and the soldier's joints ached with the sharpness he once thought reserved for the elderly. He had started counting the days since his last real meal, his last clean pair of socks, his last moment of silence. Silence. What a concept! True silence was rare. Even in lulls, there was the crackle of radios, the distant thudding of shells, the quiet weeping of a man in the corner of the trench. He had learned to cherish the quietest moments, the ones where he could hear his own heartbeat. It reminded him he was still alive. When a supply drop finally came, the men did not cheer. They moved slowly, methodically, like ghosts feeding on offerings from the land of the living. Boxes of ammunition, food, and medical supplies arrived, coated in snow and mud. Among them, a single crate of letters and newspapers. Old ones. News that was weeks outdated. Still, they read them like scripture. He held the 3rd letter from home in his trembling hands. He didn't open it right away. He placed it on his lap as he sat with his back to a trench wall, letting his eyes trace the edges of the envelope. His name, in his mother's cursive, was slightly smudged. His thumb ran over it gently, as if it might bring her voice to life. Eventually, he read it and cried. There was news of rationing back home, of bombings in the city, of his sister taking a job in a munitions factory. There was no mention of his father. He guessed what that meant. Still, his mother had signed it with love. That was enough to make him close his eyes and imagine her hands in his hair, her voice calling him in for supper. It was both a comfort and a curse. As January wore on, the snow deepened. Marches became harder. The enemy remained elusive, sometimes engaging, sometimes vanishing like smoke. The soldier had started to feel like a mouse in an endless maze, chased by a cat that never showed itself fully. His boots were soaked through daily. He had begun to lose feeling in 2 of his toes. There were rumors of an upcoming offensive. The lieutenant gathered the men one morning, reading from a piece of damp paper. They were to prepare for movement. No one asked where. The idea of mobility was both terrifying and welcome. At least it would break the rhythm. He packed what little he had: his rifle, ammunition, a canteen, a half-empty tin of meat, a scarf knitted by his sister, now threadbare. Before leaving, he knelt and pressed his palm to the frozen ground, as if to say goodbye to the trench that had become his reluctant home. Then they marched, The road was hellish. Frozen mud clung to their boots. Vehicles got stuck constantly. Horses, yes. Horses were used to haul equipment. The animals fared no better than the men. He watched one collapse from exhaustion, eyes wide and frantic, before a bullet ended its suffering. No one spoke. No one had the strength to feel outrage anymore. They passed through ruined villages, blackened by fire and shelled into skeletal remains. Sometimes they found civilians hollow-eyed, dressed in layers of mismatched clothing, clutching children. The soldier always looked away. He could not bear their eyes. He did not feel like a liberator. He felt like an intruder in someone else's nightmare. They bivouacked in a collapsed barn one night, sleeping among straw and broken boards. He was too tired to care about the rats. The corporal died that night. No one noticed until morning. They buried him under the barn's floorboards and marked it with a carved plank. The lieutenant said a few words. No one listened. The offensive came at dawn a few days later. The soldier was in the first wave. Artillery softened the enemy line, but everyone knew that meant little. They ran across open snowfields, bullets snapping overhead. He saw men fall, some silently, others screaming. He didn't remember firing his weapon. He just ran. When he reached the enemy trench, he jumped in and came face to face with a boy. A real boy, maybe 15, shaking, holding a rifle backwards. They stared at each other for a second that stretched eternity. Then the boy ran. The soldier let him. He didn't know why. He didn't care. The battle ended hours later. They held the line, whatever that meant. The lieutenant was dead. Meyer had lost an eye. They regrouped, counted the living, and dug in again. The trench was familiar, wet, cold, and full of ghosts. He opened his coat and found the fourth letter. It smelled faintly of lavender. He pressed it to his face, closed his eyes, and pretended for a moment that he was home. The rain had not let up for days now. Gray skies hung low over the shattered villages and muddy tracts of the French countryside, casting everything in a sullen, quiet light. For the soldiers in the trenches and the mobile companies stationed just behind the front, time dragged slowly forward. There were no great battles today, no sudden rushes of glory or horror, just mud, routine, and the aching weight of exhaustion. Private Karl Brenner shifted his rifle on his back and trudged slowly through the field hospital camp. The makeshift tent roofs drooped under the constant drizzle, and puddles had formed between rows of canvas. The moans of the wounded drifted out softly, dramatic, not screaming, just the constant low hum of pain that came from infected wounds, shattered limbs, and broken spirits. He wasn't injured, not physically, but his sergeant had assigned him temporary duty at the rear to help organize rations and supplies. Karl had thought it would be a break. It wasn't. There was no break. There was just a different kind of suffering here, the passive kind, where every second spent watching someone else's misery felt like time bleeding out of your soul. Inside the main supply tent, he was met with rows of crates stacked in muddy aisles, boxes labeled in stenciled ink, hardtack, evaporated milk, powdered coffee, bandages. He and another private began sorting the latest batch of provisions. Their hands worked automatically, silently. Even speaking had become an effort over the last few weeks. Time in the war didn't move like normal time. It stretched, thick and slow, between meals and marches. Every moment without gunfire felt eerily suspended, as if the world were holding its breath. Yet, even then, there was no peace. The endless buzzing of FLIs, the squelching sound of boots in wet earth, the slow decay of bodies left in fields too dangerous to reach, these were the new constants of life. Later in the day, Karl was called to help dig a drainage trench behind the latrines. This was soldiering too, not fighting, not leading charges, but clearing filth, moving earth, dealing with the never-ending problem of disease and hygiene. The officers had reminded them daily that more men in history had died of illness than bullets. He believed it now. Everyone in the unit had diarrhea. Everyone. A lieutenant passed by on horseback, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He didn't acknowledge Carl or the others. The officers were distant these days, absorbed in maps and logistics. The war had become about movements on paper, while the men lived in mud and stench and waited for orders. That night, back in the dugout, Carl scribbled something in his notebook. It wasn't a letter home. He hadn't written one in a while. He just wrote down thoughts now, disjointed and bland. The sound of rats scratching nearby had become background noise. Someone snored. Someone else coughed for an hour. The candle sputtered out twice from the draft. In the morning, it was raining again. Of course, the commander announced that they would be moving positions to kilometers east. That meant packing up, marching through slop, and setting up new positions, likely to wait there again, likely to sleep on wet ground again. Nobody groaned. No one protested. They just stood, slowly got their gear together, and started moving. The roads were barely roads anymore. Horses sank to their fetlocks. Wheels broke. Boots lost their soles. Carl saw one man fall flat in a puddle and simply not get up for a minute. He wasn't hurt. He was just tired. Someone helped him eventually. Wordless lie. In the new location. The men dug shallow foxholes. They used spoons, helmets, anything. The dirt was thick with clay and refused to move. After hours, they had barely shaped a defensive line. Still, the lieutenant seemed satisfied. Meals that night were cold beans and dry biscuits. No fire. Smoke would give away their position. Carl didn't taste the food anymore anyway. Eating was like swallowing to survive, not a pleasure, just a necessity. When he lay down in the dugout later, his back ached so badly he could hardly breathe. His socks were wet again. His fingers had gone numb. He didn't mind. That was normal. That was fine. Over the days that followed, Carl's unit continued to support the front by maintaining communication lines, ferrying messages, and digging deeper defensive structures. Sometimes the enemy artillery would start up again, not aiming directly at them, just somewhere nearby, as if reminding everyone that silence was always temporary. On one such day, a shell hit a nearby tree line. Shrapnel flew, and a corporal lost his hand. There was no screaming, just a stunned look, a thud, and then silence. Medics took him away, and the others went back to digging. Sleep was no longer restful. Men jerked awake at phantom sounds or dreamed of meals they had eaten months ago. Carl had a dream about his mother's apple pie. It hurt more than it helped. He woke up hungry and angry. He hadn't been clean in weeks. The grime clung under his nails, in the folds of his clothes, in his scalp. When it rained, they all tilted their heads back and let the drops run down their faces like a sad imitation of bathing. There were rumors again of movement on the northern front, of supplies running low, of reinforcements arriving. No one believed them. Rumors were part of the routine, like meals and watches. You heard them, then forgot them. One day, Carl was sent with 3 others to recover a broken-down truck from a supply road a mile away. It sounded simple. It took 6 hours. The mud made dragging anything impossible. They ended up leaving the truck and just carrying the crates back one at a time. The rations they recovered were mostly spoiled. Still, it counted as a success. The lieutenant noted it in the report. Another week passed, then another. Time no longer moved in days or weeks. It was just shifts, rain, hunger, and sleep. Sometimes there was gunfire, sometimes not. Men came, men left. Carl didn't learn most of their names. Then came an order. They would rotate to the front again. Their rest was over. Carl didn't react. No one did. They just began packing as They always did. Boots heavy, eyes dulled, minds already focused on surviving the next position, whatever it might bring. It was just another part of the war. The bitter cold of the Russian front did not ease, nor did the endless snow that blanketed every corner of the terrain. By the time December of 1942 settled in, the days were short and bleak, and the nights seemed to last forever. Inside the dugout, Wilhelm sat hunched over, rubbing his hands together for warmth, while the small iron stove emitted a dull, red glow. The embers within it barely did anything to cut through the frost that clung to the inside of the walls like mold. His breath came out in short, sharp clouds, as he tried to write a letter home by the faint light of a sputtering oil lamp. His fingers, numb and aching, could barely grasp the pencil. He paused often, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the pencil kept slipping and he had to shake life back into his hand. Outside, the wind howled across the steps, picking up drifts of snow and hurling them against the flimsy wooden walls of the shelter. The letter was simple. It always was. He would tell his mother that he was well, that the food was manageable, and that he still had the scarf she had sent. He didn't mention the frostbite creeping into the toes of his boots, or the comrades who had quietly stopped speaking one by one, fading into blank stares and exhaustion before being carried away. Their unit had not moved in days. Supplies were running low, and they were instructed to stay in their current position and wait for orders. The rumor was that the Soviets were surrounding the city of Stalingrad. Some men had drawn lines in the dirt to show where they thought the Red Army had reached. No one knew for sure. The only news came from the occasional radio crackle, and even those were becoming less frequent. It wasn't the fighting that haunted Wilhelm the most, not now. It was the silence, the constant, gnawing stillness broken only by coughing, shuffling, and sometimes the faint thud of something collapsing under the weight of snow. Silence meant waiting. Waiting for food, for orders, for a shell to land, or for sleep to finally claim him. But sleep was becoming harder. Dreams were worse. The meals, if they could be called that, had shrunk again. A stale hunk of bread, some tinned meat when they were lucky, and a cup of something that resembled coffee. They joked about it being made from burnt wood or dirt. There was no laughter when they said it. One evening, just as dusk turned the horizon to charcoal, a new consignment of troops arrived. Young faces, thinner than expected, wearing oversized uniforms and clutching their rifles like lifelines. Wilhelm watched them climb down from the covered truck, boots crunching against the snow. They looked around with a mix of confusion and dread. One of them asked if this was the front. Wilhelm had nodded slowly, saying nothing. These replacements always arrived too hopeful. It wouldn't last long. The weather, the hunger, and the waiting were it out of them within days. There was no combat that week, just the slow grind of trying to stay alive. They passed the time cleaning weapons, digging snow out of pathways, patching up gear with scraps. Even boredom became a kind of pain. Then, one night, a different sound echoed across the ice, the distant thumping of artillery. It was soft at first, almost like thunder far away, but it grew louder, steadier. Everyone sat up. Orders were barked. Positions were checked. Helmets fastened. The anticipation, sharp and cold, ran through every man. But the barrage didn't come closer. It stayed distant, haunting the air, like a warning. That was when the commander called a night march. They were to move to a secondary trench line further east. The old trench had become too vulnerable, too exposed. Packing quickly, Wilhelm layered on as many garments as he could find. Marching through snow at night was a special kind of suffering. Feet numb, muscles aching, vision obscured by sleet and breath. Every step felt like dragging bricks. Men collapsed along the way, not from wounds, but from sheer exhaustion. Two had to be carried. The group moved in silence, save for the occasional grunt or whispered curse. By morning, The horizon bled a pale gray, and they reached the next set of trenches. There was no relief, just another hole in the ground. Digging resumed. Even in the frozen dirt, shovels struck ice again and again. Blisters opened on hands that were already raw. They built new walls with snow bricks and planks scavenged from abandoned posts. Someone had found a broken-down cart and used it to create a roof over one of the dugouts. Inside this new shelter, Wilhelm lay on his back, eyes open to the wooden slats above. He had not changed clothes in over a week. The smell of sweat, mold, and rot hung thick in the air. But still, he counted his blessings. He had socks, he had a coat, and his rifle was clean. The brutal winter days dragged on. Some soldiers tried to pass the time by carving pieces of wood or playing simple games with pebbles. A pair of brothers, stationed in the same squad, took turns reading aloud from a tattered copy of a novel they'd found in an abandoned farmhouse. No one paid much attention to the story, but the sound of a human voice, even one reading fiction, was oddly comforting. Then, a report came down. A reconnaissance mission was needed. 3 men. Quiet approach. Wilhelm volunteered, not from bravery, but because moving, doing anything, seemed better than more waiting. They set out at dusk, crossing snowfields that reflected the moonlight too brightly. Every step was calculated, rifles slung, breath held. They reached the ridge overlooking a small village, now occupied by Soviet forces. Smoke curled up from chimneys. They watched in silence, noting patterns, movement, numbers. Then one of them slipped just a small crunch, but it was enough. A flare shot up. Gunfire erupted. They ran. Bullets snapped through the air. Wilhelm dove behind a mound of frozen earth, heart pounding. One of the other scouts was hit. He didn't scream, just crumpled. They dragged him back, slipping, scrambling, till they reached the trench line. The wounded man groaned softly. A medic arrived with a kit that looked decades old. They did what they could. That night, the wind howled louder. The earth itself seemed to groan. Wilhelm lay awake, listening to the wounded man's shallow breathing. War was not about victories. Not here. It was about inches gained or lost, warmth stolen or spared, sleep won or denied. It was about surviving until the next silence, and then another, and another. The heavy boots of soldiers echoed dully through the frozen mud, their steps out of sync, neither fast nor slow, just dragging, not because they were lazy or indifferent, but because they had learned the pace of war. War didn't reward speed. War rewarded survival, and in the dead fields of Eastern Europe, survival meant learning how to move slowly enough to avoid attention, but quickly enough to avoid frostbite. The air no longer smelled of gunpowder, at least not today, but of smoke, wet earth, and boiled cabbage. It was the kind of smell that clung to uniforms and stayed with you longer than memory. Inside a small farmhouse, half collapsed by earlier shelling and now serving as a makeshift bunker, men sat in silence. The stove was no longer burning. They had run out of fuel 2 nights ago. They now huddled in circles, using their own bodies for warmth, shoulders pressed against shoulders, arms crossed, some of them still chewing on hard bread that had the texture of stone and the taste of old air. No one spoke unless they had to. There was no strength left for conversation, and besides, what was there to say? Tomorrow they might march again, or tomorrow they might not. A young soldier, barely 20, leaned against the cold brick wall, staring at a photograph. It was not of a sweetheart or his family, but of a dog, a mutt from back home that used to follow him to school. The corners of the photo had curled, and a brown fingerprint covered half the image. It was one of the last things in his kit that reminded him he had once lived somewhere else, where things grew and the sun rose warm. Around him, snores rose and fell like waves, short, raspy bursts of breath that told you who had a cold, who had a broken nose, and who had finally surrendered to the exhaustion that waited like a second enemy. The squad's commanding officer, Lieutenant Branner, stood outside the house, hunched beneath a wide, brown army coat. His face was unreadable, not because it was emotionless, but because it was layered. Fatigue, cold, responsibility, and guilt sat there together. He held a clipboard in his hands, scanning numbers, trying to determine how many men still had working boots. It wasn't strategy anymore. It wasn't war games. It was logistics, pure and simple. How many working feet? How many hands that could hold a rifle? How many spoons that hadn't been lost or bent out of shape in the fire? War had been reduced to counting. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by mist and snow, artillery sounded, but no one flinched. The noise had become part of the weather, like wind or thunder. It was only when the sound came closer, like a burst of cracking trees, that men paused, shifted their eyes, and checked the skies or the hills. But today, it was still far, close enough to be known, far enough not to act. By afternoon, message arrived. Not by radio, it hadn't worked in days, but by foot courier. A soldier from another company, wrapped in canvas and coughing blood, arrived. With a slip of folded paper, he had walked 12 kilometers. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut from cold. He did not speak. He only handed the message to the lieutenant and sat down by the wall, breathing shallowly until he fell asleep or unconscious. No one was sure. The message? A relocation order. At first, no one believed it. Orders meant movement. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant death. But it was signed, stamped, and authentic. They were to fall back 6 miles and join the remaining companies for restructuring. The word restructuring in war often meant, what's left of you will be made useful again. That night, no one slept well. Packs were slowly assembled. In the dark, some men tried to lighten their loads, tossing out metal shaving kits, extra socks that had frozen into stiff shapes, and even letters from home that had long since been memorized. There was no room for sentiment when you had to march through snowdrifts and across broken roads. One soldier debated throwing away his helmet. It was dented, heavy, and cold, but he knew better. He slid it back on and said nothing. Before dawn, the column began to move. Slowly, like an ancient procession of monks, they filed out of the ruins, boots scraping frozen stone, eyes forward, rifles slung, breath steaming. The wind had picked up again, sweeping the snow across the fields in long, low veils that made the world seem like it was erasing itself. The silence among them was not from fear, but routine. Even the jokes had stopped weeks ago. Jokes were reserved for fresh troops, not those who had buried friends and counted calories in single digits. The only noise was the crunching snow and the occasional cough, and once, the sound of something collapsing far behind them, an old barn finally giving way to time, or memory. At midday, they passed a village that had been flattened. Smoke still rose from the middle of it, though no fire was visible. A well stood near the road, its bucket frozen mid-drop, the rope twisted by wind. A child's shoe lay near the edge, half buried in ash. The lieutenant did not stop. No one did. What was there to see? What was there to mourn when mourning had become too common? They kept moving. Hills came next, long, slow hills covered in pine. The pines whispered in the wind like old women gossiping. The snow beneath them was softer, making the march harder. Boots sank, ankles twisted, packs shifted, but no one complained. One soldier fell. His leg gave out on a slope, and he rolled backward. He didn't cry out. He simply lay there, eyes open, waiting. 2 others helped him up, one on each side, and walked in silence. They didn't ask if he could make it. That was not the point. Everyone kept moving. The sun never quite broke through the clouds. It remained a pale disk, low in the sky, like a memory of warmth. Shadows were faint and long. By dusk, they reached the halfway mark, a burned-out school building near a stream. There, they stopped. Fires were lit from scavenged wood, and boots came off. Steam rose from wet socks. A few cans of meat were opened, and even though the taste was metallic and past expiry, it was food. Men chewed without looking at one another. Lieutenant Branner read the second half of the orders by firelight. They were to remain here for one night. In the morning, scouts would go ahead. Then the rest would follow. A new position had been mapped near a railway station. There would be tents, supplies, possibly even letters, but no one believed it. They had heard it before. Still, they waited. Some prayed, not for safety, but for numbness. For the kind of fatigue that made even nightmares seem slow. The kind that made you forget the name of your hometown, or the color of your front door. As the night grew colder, the sky filled with stars, too many to count. One man looked up and muttered something about how the stars never changed, even when everything else did. No one answered. It wasn't a question. The stars watched as the soldiers slept on the floor, near the fire, under coats that still smelled of blood and diesel. War didn't stop when the guns were silent. It just moved into the bones, the dreams, the marrow, and still, the boots waited by the door. There was no great moment of awakening, no dramatic shift in the course of the war. The soldiers' days had simply faded from one into the next like watercolors bleeding on damp paper. Time no longer held its form. No weekends, no mornings, no proper nights. Just long strings of gray hours marked by the distant boom of artillery, the endless creaking of damp boots, and the whispered rustle of wind across empty fields. They were stationed now near a forgotten French village whose name he could not pronounce and would soon forget. The buildings were mostly rubble, charred beams leaning like broken ribs from the earth. Once, perhaps, it had been a place of laughter and church bells, with bakeries that smelled of fresh bread. Now, it was mud and silence, interrupted by the cautious clank of metal and the dragging of canvas bedrolls. Each morning began before the sun, or rather, before the sky turned any shade of light. The men were awakened not by bugles or orders, but by the cold, a deep, bone-heavy cold that crept through their threadbare blankets and burrowed into their backs. Shivering, the soldier would rise, always careful not to make too much noise. The frost had a way of amplifying everything. Even the soft crunch of stepping on a brittle leaf felt like thunder. Breakfast, if one could call it that, came in dented tins that smelled faintly of rust. The coffee was mostly water. Sometimes, if the supply trucks had managed to push through, they'd receive something called meat hash, though no one could quite tell what meat it used to be. Most days, they didn't ask. You learned not to question things in war. You simply chewed, swallowed, and hoped your stomach would follow through. Orders came slowly and without ceremony. A corporal would shuffle over, clipboard in hand, muttering instructions that passed through the camp like a weak signal. Patrols were routine not because they were safe, but because danger had become routine. The soldier found himself trudging through the same frost-covered woods, scanning tree lines for movement, noting patterns in the distant smoke, listening always for the sudden crack that meant someone had stepped where they shouldn't have. Time passed strangely on patrol. Some hours felt like days. Some entire afternoons vanished in a blink. The brain, dulled by repetition and fear, began to skip beats. He found himself staring at patches of moss or cracked bark, forgetting why he was looking until someone hissed his name. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting sleep, cold, hunger, and the constant weight of thought. At night, there were no real beds, just canvas tents barely wide enough to lie in. The soldier's sleeping mat was thin and damp, smelling faintly of old socks and mildew. He would lie still, staring up at the canvas above him, watching it ripple gently in the wind. Sometimes, the rain came. When it did, it found the holes in the seams. Droplets would gather, then fall slow, cold taps on the forehead. If you were lucky, you slept. If you weren't, you waited for morning. He thought often of home, but less clearly than before. The edges of memory had begun to smudge. His mother's voice, once sharp and kind, had become more of a tone than a sentence. The streets of his hometown, once full of light and purpose, now appeared only as vague shapes in a fog. He tried to recall the color of the sky back there. Was it ever really blue, or had that too been something he imagined? Mail came rarely. When it did, it was passed around like treasure. Men unfolded envelopes with trembling hands, holding the paper close as if warming their faces on it. Most letters smelled of perfume or cooking spice, fragments of a different world. The soldier's last letter was 2 months old. It had arrived, torn, the ink smudged by someone's wet fingers. But he read it again and again, each word a thread anchoring him to something real. There was little talk of progress. The war moved as it always had, slow, brutal, indifferent. They heard rumors that the Allies had pushed forward, that towns had been taken, that new fronts were forming. But here, in the cold mud of nowhere, it was just another day. Another patrol. Another friend gone without a sound. One evening, as the sky turned the color of burned ash, the soldier sat near a half-collapsed wall, wrapping his fingers around a tin mug of lukewarm tea. Across from him, a young recruit no older than 17 was humming softly. Not a tune the soldier knew, just a sound, low and aimless, like wind over an empty bottle. The recruit caught his eye and smiled faintly, a small gesture that asked nothing. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. And so, the war continued, not with glory or speeches, but with quiet footsteps, sore backs, and the dull ache of waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for silence, waiting for the end whenever, wherever it might come. The icy wind never truly stopped in the forest near the H region. It merely took small pauses before returning with the same tired breath, brushing across tree trunks and trembling the fabric of worn greatcoats. The trees there didn't move much anymore. Many had been splintered by shellfire, others stood, half dead, stripped of leaves by the season, or the war, or both. What remained were the silhouettes of 1,000 quiet witnesses, each one frozen like the soldiers beneath them, stuck in a moment that refused to pass. Heinrich had long stopped feeling the weight of his pack. It wasn't that it had grown lighter. His shoulders had simply grown numb, just like his feet and the tips of his fingers. When you no longer remembered warmth, the cold became a permanent part of your skin. His unit hadn't moved forward in 2 days. They hadn't gone back either. There were rumors of an attack. There were always rumors, but no orders had come. Only more hours, then a night, then a morning that looked exactly like the one before. Sleep came in scattered pieces, no longer in full stretches. You might close your eyes during the shelling and open them an hour later, unsure if you had actually rested or merely passed into some shallow, forgettable place. Dreams had stopped entirely for many of the men. Their minds had emptied themselves of stories, replacing them with hollow quiet. Rations had frozen. Soldiers would tuck cans under their armpits to warm them up just enough to puncture with a dull knife. Most meals tasted of metal and mud. Water was collected from the snow, boiled over fuel tablets when they had them. Otherwise, they drank it cold, letting it melt on their tongues, hoping it hadn't mixed with the filth that ran off from the trenches. Voices were soft now. No one shouted, not even the officers. Orders were whispered, mostly hand signs. Even fear, that old companion, had taken on a different shape, less panic, more a background buzz, like a headache that wouldn't go away, but didn't scream either. It just sat there, constant, patient. Heinrich had started counting things, not for any reason, just to stay occupied. He counted how many steps it took to cross their position. He counted the times a crow circled above before flying off. He counted the cracks in the stock of his rifle. Each number was something solid, something real. In a world where days bled into nights and silence stretched for hours, numbers were a kind of anchor, across from their line. Somewhere deep in the mist, the enemy waited. They could hear them sometimes distant coughing, the clink of a shovel, dog barking. The Germans were dug in, same as them. The forest had become a mutual tomb. No one advanced, no one retreated. They simply existed in parallel, both sides, staring into the gray between them, knowing someone would move eventually, and that movement would bring fire. Letters from home had grown rare. Postal routes couldn't always reach them, and even when they did, the words inside felt ghostly. What did "I miss you" mean when the writer couldn't imagine this mud? What did "come back safe" mean in a place where men disappeared? Between meals, still, the letters were read again and again, folded and unfolded until the edges tore and the creases faded. Sometimes, a soldier would talk about after the war, after the snow, after the last bullet. These were the dangerous ones. Hope could weaken you. It made you think about clean clothes and warm beds, about meals that didn't come from tins and voices that weren't whispers. Most of them had stopped imagining after. Now was safer. Now you could predict. Now was cold and painful and real. A medic named Schultz had stopped shaving 2 weeks ago. His face had grown rough, not with pride but indifference. He used to hum when he worked on the wounded. Now, he didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. His hands moved efficiently, wrapping wounds, tying off dressings, injecting morphine with the care of a man folding laundry. Death had taken on a procedural rhythm. You wiped the face. You covered the eyes. You moved on. Near the edge of their sector, a young private had lost part of his hearing from a shell. He didn't talk much anymore. He mostly stared forward, lips slightly parted, as if listening to something that wasn't there. Heinrich once saw him cradling a frozen pigeon, speaking to it softly, as if it could understand. The forest had rules. Now, you didn't cry out. You didn't stand up to tall. You didn't complain about your feet because someone else had already lost theirs. You didn't open letters out loud. You didn't ask about the future. You didn't look too long at the dead because they looked just like you. When artillery did come, it was brief and cruel. Trees exploded, not from fire, but pressure, bark turning into shrapnel. Sometimes it was over before anyone reacted. Other times, it came at night, when dreams were just beginning to return. Then you'd lie in the mud, clutching your helmet, praying. The next round wasn't yours. Then silence again. Then waiting. One afternoon, the sun appeared just a flicker through the branches, too weak to warm anything. But it was real. For a moment, Heinrich just stared at it. It looked foreign, like something he had once known, but forgotten the name of. He didn't smile. No one did. But for a few minutes, the gray lifted slightly. That night, a corporal sang a song under his breath. Just one verse. Just enough to remind them there had once been music. N01 stopped him. N01 joined in. They just listened. The boots were soaked again. Rain had returned, not in violent bursts, but in a quiet, endless drizzle that blurred the lines between earth and sky. The field where the soldiers had dug in was a muddy graveyard of twisted iron, scorched timber, and a stench that had become part of them. Every breath tasted of metal and rot. Thompson rubbed his temples under his steel helmet. The pressure behind. His eyes never left anymore, like a silent hammer pounding the same nail over and over again. Around him, men sat in silence. Not the silence of rest, but that strange emptiness after too much noise, where the mind retreats and leaves only the body behind. Rain slipped down their necks, trickling into collars, soaking through uniforms, numbing shoulders. A distant thud echoed, not close, not urgent, but always present. Artillery, like a heartbeat of the war, regular, inescapable. A few of the men flinched instinctively, even though the impact was miles off. It didn't matter anymore. They reacted now not because they were afraid, but because their nerves had learned to twitch without permission. Thompson glanced toward the edge of the trench. A letter poked from his pocket, the one from his sister, back home. He hadn't opened it yet. Didn't want to. Not today. Not while the mud was still warm from the blood of the last shelling. Beside him, Private Harris muttered something about beans. Always the beans. The army had found endless cans of the stuff, and it had become the unofficial taste of this sector. Thompson smirked weakly, not at the joke, but at the attempt to pretend. Pretending helped. Pretending was necessary. A whistle blew, not shrill, not commanding, but a gentle call. Time for the watch rotation. Thompson stood up slowly, knees cracking like frost-bitten branches. He handed his rifle to Harris, who took it without a word. The exchange was ritual, now familiar, like passing a torch at a graveyard vigil. Thompson walked the edge of the trench, boots squelching with each step. He passed a tangle of wire, some rusted, some freshly cut. Past a helmet lying upside down, filled with rainwater and a single floating cigarette. Past a face he didn't recognize, eyes closed, skin to pale. He didn't ask names anymore. A T, the lookout post. Corporal Mendez nodded. No movement since dawn, just the wind. Still too quiet, Thompson said. Mendez shrugged. Quiet's better than screaming. For a moment, neither man spoke. Just watched the gray mist hanging low over the shattered tree line. Trees that once stood tall now looked like broken bones clawing at the sky. How long since your last letter? Thompson asked. 4 weeks. Might as well be 4 years. Thompson nodded. He knew the feeling. In war, time stretched and collapsed like a concertina wire. Some days felt eternal. Some months disappeared like smoke in a breeze. A soft crack. Behind them, not gunfire, but a branch snapping. Both men turned, fingers brushing rifles. But it was only Daniels, the kid from Detroit. His eyes darted like a rabbit's. They need more water down at the southern line, Daniels whispered. Mendez pointed toward the barrels. Take 2, and watch your step. The left slope's slick. Daniels nodded, grabbed the water containers, and scurried off into the mud. Thompson watched him vanish into the haze. That kid still thought this war was a bad dream he'd wake up from. Most of them did when they first arrived. He leaned back against the trench wall and let the drizzle fall on his face. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog, beyond the endless gray, was the enemy. And somewhere beyond them was home. But both felt equally distant now. The day slid by with the same quiet rhythm, not in hours, but in motions, boots over mud, the clink of mess tins, the distant thud of artillery. No one checked the time anymore. Watches had stopped or were broken, and besides, in war, time wasn't something you needed to measure, you just had to survive it. Thompson sat beneath the overhang of sandbags, cleaning the bolt of his rifle with a faded cloth. The action was mindless. He'd done it so many times now that the movement required no thought, no effort. It helped fill the hours, or maybe just push them away. He heard boots approaching from behind. It was Sergeant Langford, his heavy coat darkened by rain, folded, map clutched in his hand. His mustache twitched slightly when he spoke, a habit that had somehow survived months in the mud. Orders came down. They want a night recon. Small group. Quiet. We're looking for wire gaps along the eastern rise. Thompson said nothing, just nodded. These missions weren't uncommon, nor were they safe. Night meant shadows, and shadows meant danger you couldn't see coming. But orders were orders, and silence was often the only reply you needed. Langford gave a short nod and moved on. Thompson set the rifle aside and began packing what little he needed: extra ammo, wire cutters, a flashlight. With the lens painted red, his fingers worked methodically, like he was folding memories into each pouch and strap. As twilight fell, the trench began to change. Voices softened, movements slowed. The glow of cigarettes became more cautious, shielded by cupped hands. The air thickened with tension, the kind that slipped into the lungs and sat heavy on the chest. At the edge of the trench, 4 men gathered: Thompson, Mendez, Daniels, and Corporal Klein. Klein was the oldest of them, his hair already going gray. At the temples, he had the calm eyes of someone who had seen too much and stopped keeping track. Langford gave a quiet briefing. You'll move north along the low ridge, stay below the rise, scout the wire line, mark any gaps. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. Radio check at 0300. They nodded. No one asked questions. Questions were for men who expected answers. The night had fallen fully by the time they climbed from the trench. The world above was a different one, quieter, wider, and colder. Each step was cautious, placed heel to toe. Mud pulled at their boots, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of gear or the distant wind through shattered trees. The eastern rise loomed ahead, faint against the overcast sky. They moved along the base of it, the slope to their left, a barbed horizon to their right. Every so often, they paused, listening, watching, holding still until the wind moved again. Daniels tapped Thompson on the shoulder. He pointed ahead, a break in the wire, small, but enough. They moved forward, marked the position with the length of white cloth tied low to a stake. No lights, no noise, just the steady rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Suddenly, a flare arced into the sky. It burst overhead with a hiss, casting the land in pale, flickering light. All 4 men dropped instantly, faces pressed to the mud. Hearts raced. Seconds passed. A voice called faintly in German, then silence. They waited. Long minutes crept by. Then, slowly, the darkness returned. The flare died. The world was still again. Klein whispered, "No patrol. Just a warning shot. Let's move." They crawled for a while, slow, deliberate, until they could stand and walk again. On the way back, they passed the shell of an old farmhouse, half collapsed, ivy climbing through windows where glass once lived. A rusted bicycle leaned against the stone wall, unmoved since peace was last here. Thompson stared at it for a moment, then looked away. By the time they returned, the trench was asleep, if such a thing was possible. Men huddled in blankets, helmets tilted over eyes, rifles close at hand. The recon team filed back in quietly. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Thompson collapsed onto his blanket, still in his wet boots, and let his body sink into the earth. His mind drifted, not to home, not to peace, but to the bicycle, to the stone wall, to a time when the farmhouse held warmth instead of ghosts. And somewhere, above the clouds, stars still existed. But no one here looked up anymore.